Good afternoon. I want to begin by asking all of you in the audience to shut your eyes, gently. And as you shut your eyes, I want you to think of three women. These can be any women. They can be women that you know very well, you've known your entire life. They can be women you've just met, somebody you saw on the street who left a mark on you. It could be a doctor, a teacher, a parent, a sister, a mother, an aunt, anybody. And as you hold the image of these three women in your mind's eye right now, I want you to listen to this. One out of these three women will in her lifetime experience physical or sexual assault. Let me repeat. One out of these three women will in her lifetime be beaten or raped. If your eyes haven't already popped open with those numbers, gently open them now. Those statistics that I just gave you are from a 2004 study by the United Nations and bolstered more recently in 2013-14 by a World Health Organization study, which says that one out of every three women living on this planet will in her lifetime experience physical or sexual assault. If you do the math, given the current demographic levels that we have, that means that we currently have on this earth over 1 billion women who have been assaulted physically or sexually. In India, sadly, we believe that that number is closer to 1 out of every 2 women, which means that in India, we have over 300 million women who have been raped and beaten in their lifetimes. And this doesn't even begin to count the other forms of violence that we inflict upon women, psychological, emotional, etc. Clearly, we don't just have a problem of violence against women. We have what is undoubtedly, globally and nationally, a pandemic of violence against women. I have even gone so far as to refer to this as a global and a national security threat. You all probably remember very clearly that day, that moment, perhaps what you were wearing, where you were, what you were thinking, when you heard about a young 23-year-old paramedic in New Delhi who boarded a bus with her then boyfriend, who was then proceeded to be brutally raped, gang raped for hours on a bus, and her boyfriend beaten to a pulp when he intervened, both their bodies finally thrown off their bus onto the dark road, her insides literally unraveling outside her body on that tar. That young girl eventually died, and we got to know her as Nirbhaya. Those of us that have been involved in the anti-violence movement thought that finally here was a moment that would result in and amount to some real change. Here was a moment where we would finally see change from the grassroots, where something real would break open and change vis-a-vis this pandemic. I don't need to tell you, because you all probably know, that very, very little has changed since almost exactly that day 6 years ago, December 16th of 2012. The news before Nirbhaya's brutal rape and murder was equally bad. Take the case from 2010 of a 13-and-a-half-year-old young girl who was abducted by 4 boys and brutally gang raped for hours. When she managed to escape them and crawl her way to a brick kiln, she was raped by 2 workers over there. When they finally released her in the evening, she found herself by the side of the road, and a rickshaw driver offered to give her help only to take her somewhere and rape her. And when he dropped her off by the side of that same road, she was finally picked up by a truck driver and his aide, and you may have guessed it by now. They held her captive for 9 days and raped her constantly. In that same village, exactly a year later, a 3-and-a-half-year-old girl was gang raped. The news after Nirbhaya has not been particularly easy either. The numbers have been escalating and the crime seeming to get more and more macabre. Take the case from Rohtak, Haryana in 2017, May, where a 20-year-old woman is abducted by 2 men and gang raped. And when they're done with her, they beat her face in with a brick, killing her. The autopsy reveals that when her body was found, the woman had no food pipe in her, and that her anus and her vagina had been repeatedly penetrated by sharp metal objects. Her body was found in a deserted field with its lower half eaten away by dogs. Take the case from Badaun, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, in that same year, in that same month, where 2 Dalit sisters walked into a field not because they needed a stroll or were trying to get away, but because they had no toilet in their home. They were abducted by 3 men, including 2 police officers, and gang raped, and their bodies were eventually hung from a mango tree to eventually die. What we have done and our response to these crimes and all the others has been inadequate at best and despicably complicit in that violence at worst. By the time I'm done with my talk today, 1 more Indian woman will have joined that roster of victims that I have just named, given that every 22 minutes a woman is raped in India. And we know that given the problems we have with reporting and with gathering that information, these numbers are sadly probably too low and underreported. But I don't want us sitting here in our sort of relative enclaves of privilege to think that these are just problems that exist with women from the rural areas, from other states where there's less education, where there's more poverty. These issues of violence against women globally, and of course in our country, cut across all sorts of barriers: economic, geographic, in terms of ethnicity, race, religion, you name it. The idea here is that the issues of violence against women has led us to conclude that for the last many, many centuries, there has been a war against women. And those of us involved in this field have in the last couple of decades realized that there is also an ongoing war on women. Now, linguistically, this may not make much sense, but let me explain. What I mean and what other activists mean by a war on women is that increasingly global conflicts are literally being fought and settled on the bodies of women. That's to say that institutions, both currently and in the past, institutions like certain religious institutions, political policies, economic policies, cultural mores and practices, educational policies, have all been using the bodies of women to settle their vested agendas, to fight for their various interests. And I can give you a couple of these examples to just explain what this means. Take, for example, the case of female feticide. We often hear of these cases from, again, the rural, sort of what we consider as the more backward states: Chhattisgarh, Haryana, Jharkhand, Bihar. But what most people don't know, that in Mumbai, in an area called Malabar Hill, which is one of the most wealthy and well-to-do enclaves, not only in this country and in that city, but perhaps in the world, the rates of female feticide are as high as they are in those states. The only difference, the people in Malabar Hill had the wealth to take their girls across continents, to check out the gender of their first child, and if necessary, have it aborted. These issues, again, cut across all sorts of geographic lines. There's a particular and quite controversial issue when it comes to more middle class and upper class women economically. And I maintain this position, even though I get into a lot of trouble for saying it. But I consider the use of whitening creams and the imposition of whitening creams upon young women and girls to be a form of violence against them. I would also say this, that recently we're starting to see a trend in very elite circles where young women in their last year of high school are being carted off by their parents to plastic surgeons to get them fixed for impending marriages. That is violence. So I want to dispel this myth that somehow these are issues that affect just the upper class. There's one other example of this war on women that I really want to illustrate over here, because it's something that very few of us know about. There's currently an ongoing war in the Congo in Africa, which has been going on since 2003. It is currently the longest war in modern human history, and it has claimed to date over 6 million lives, second only to and certainly to surpass the Holocaust of World War II. This war has been waged over certain minerals that the Congo is rich in: tantalum, tin, tungsten, gold, and coltan. And these minerals are used largely in our cell phones, our digital cameras, our PlayStations, our Game Boys, and our tablets. 80% of the minerals supplied for these gadgets comes from the Congo. And the Congo, because it is in a very politically unstable area, literally clears out villages and areas where these minerals are found, primarily by raping their women. Girls as young as 3 and women as old as 85 have been gang raped. Young women have been forced to bear rape from their fathers because their fathers and brothers and grandfathers are held at gunpoint to rape their own daughters, sisters, and granddaughters. Now, we're not going to ever be able to reverse the trend of being reliant on these gadgets, but the next time we are tempted to buy a new gadget just because it's new, just because Apple tells us we have to have it, or just because the camera is 1 megapixel better than the last iteration, I want you to think about the war in Congo. And I want you to think about whether it's worth some more women being gang raped by their fathers, their brothers, and their grandfathers. Now, I didn't always know this. I didn't know any of this till about 15, 20 years ago, when I became what I now call an accidental activist. And my accidental activism came about by starting to be associated with a play called The Vagina Monologues by an amazing woman who I'm proud to call my friend, Eve Ensler. My mother and I, we have a theater company which started in the United States, and we now have it in India. And in 2003, we were lucky enough to be able to bring this play to India. And we thought, of course, that the play would only last a few months given the climate in India. And I'm very proud and honored to say that in March of next year, we will be beginning our 17th year of doing that production in this country. The rewards that we have gotten from doing that play have been mind-boggling. And it is a true testament to the power of art. I say this especially because we have young people here and we have educators here. Art has a real power not just to change individuals, but also to transform societies. Very briefly, I just want to give you a few examples of how we have literally seen this change through this play. First of all, we've been very privileged enough through the play to start several movements in this country based on the American versions of it called V-Day and 1 Billion Rising, where we help raise funds and we help raise awareness to end this violence towards women and girls. After every performance of this play since we started, we've been maintaining a comment book for audiences to write in. And we constantly hear about how watching the play has changed people, men and women, how they become more enlightened, how they might become more engaged with their bodies and their sexualities, how they realize that these issues need attention and that sadly they've not paid any attention to them at all. But we even hear about more profound change when audience members come backstage and speak to us in person, or when we bump into them at an airport or at a hotel while we're traveling. Some of these transformational stories include women who, after watching the play, have realized that they've been living in abusive situations for years, even decades, and how watching that play has shown them that the only way to change that is to walk away from that violence, to change that situation. That's the power of that art. We've had situations where young women sitting in the audience, older women, have confronted their past traumas. We had a case only about 2 years ago where a young woman sitting in the audience slid off her chair and collapsed. And we stopped the play, took her to the green room, got her some help, resumed the show. And at the end, we found out that this young woman, while watching the play, which is incidentally based on interviews with 200 women all over the world and is all true stories, this young woman who had fainted realized that she was reconfronting the trauma of having walked in on her uncle raping her sister. And she had confronted that uncle and her family about that uncle having raped that young girl profoundly over a period of years. Family did absolutely nothing, but this young girl watching that play realized at that moment that she had not fully dealt with the issues and that she needed somehow to confront them. And even more magically, we were able to meet the young girl who was raped by that uncle in Delhi a few months later when we went there to perform. And she said that the play had transformed her life as well. We have a lot of mothers coming backstage who have been victims of female genital mutilation in their lifetimes. I don't know if any of you know what female genital mutilation is, but it's basically a practice where young girls are forced to have their clitorises cut or entirely removed, often by non-medical practitioners who use things like razors, scissors, or even glass shards. And the basic idea of this practice is to completely take away the ability for a young girl ever in her life to have sexual pleasure. And we have these mothers who have witnessed this and been victim of this come backstage and say that they are swearing never to let their daughters go through this ever again. That is profound change. So I have been, and the people around me, we've been incredibly blessed by this play, by being turned into these accidental activists. Because barring the issue of climate change, I don't think that there is any other issue that needs more of our attention and more of our resources than this pandemic of violence against women. Because all the other issues, including, by the way, what we have done to nature and what we are doing to her, is actually directly connected to how we treat our women. And that's perhaps the topic for another TED Talk. So, in conclusion, I just want to say that if you ever have the ability to make any difference in this issue, please do. Please know that there are people around you, 1 out of every 3 women around you, 1 out of 2 in this country, is probably going to face some of these issues and probably not be able to share that. Be that person who probably helps bring about that change. And finally, never give up in the power of art. Those of you that are pursuing the arts, and educators in particular, I implore you to allow the arts to do the transformational work that it can. Thank you.